15th, 2023 Finance and Budget Committee meeting. Roll call, please.
Thank you, Chair. Councilmember Shields?
Here.
Councilmember Edson?
Here.
Councilmember Hodges is absent. Mayor Pro Tem Lopez is absent. Chair Demaro.
Here. First order of business, approval of the agenda.
Chair.
Yes, Councilman.
Move to approve the agenda as presented. Second.
Thank you. I have a motion and a second to approve the agenda. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Shields?
Aye.
Councilmember Edson?
Aye.
Chair Demaro.
Aye. That's 3 ayes to approve the agenda. Next up, public comments.
Chair, we did not have any public comments submitted for tonight's meeting, and we do not have any public in attendance.
Okay, thank you. We'll move right into business then. The approval of the April 17th, 2023 Finance and Budget Committee action letter. Would entertain a motion. Yes,
Chair.
Councilmember Edson.
I move to approve the April 17th, 2023 Finance and Budget Committee action letter.
Second.
I have a motion by Councilmember Edson, a second by Councilmember Shields to approve the April 17th, 2023 Finance and Budget Committee action letter. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Edson?
Aye.
Councilmember Shields?
Aye.
Chair Demaro.
Aye. Thank you. That passes unanimously, 3 ayes. Next up, Bill number 23-102, an ordinance approving the Second Amendment to the Master Services Agreement between OPG 3 Inc., a Minnesota corporation, and the City of Lee Summit to modify the laserfish license types and counts available in the city under the agreement and authorizing the city manager to execute the same by on behalf of the city. Steve Marsh, good afternoon.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to be before you today. This is a pretty simple request. When we originally established the agreement with OPG to acquire licenses for laserfish, the ordinance was very specific in the license types that we were acquiring. OPG came to us in a March timeframe and said, did you know you could switch from one license type, being a perpetual, you own the license, to a subscription model, and we would be able to supply licenses to all staff, and the cost increase would be marginal, around the $2,000–3,000 range to add 160 some users into our participant group of licenses. But to make that change, we needed to come back to council to request modification of the original ordinance, which was specific about the licenses, and the change itself just says that we were going to acquire licenses as needed based on the license type that is being provided by Laserfish and OPG. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay. Any questions from the committee members? It's pretty standard to me. Okay, yeah, so, thank you. I'll entertain a motion. We'll move this forward.
Chair.
Yes, Councilmember Shields.
Thank you. I move to recommend to council for approval Bill number 23-102, an ordinance approving the Second Amendment to the Master Services Agreement between OPG 3 Inc., a Minnesota corporation, and the City of Lee Summit to modify the laserfish license types and counts available to the city under the agreement, and authorizing the city manager to execute the same by and on behalf of the city.
Second.
Thank you. I have a motion by Councilmember Shields, a second by Councilmember Edson to move Bill number 23-102 to full council with a recommendation of approval. No discussion. Roll call, please.
Thank you, Chair. Councilmember Shields?
Aye.
Councilmember Edson?
Aye.
Chair Demaro.
Aye. That's unanimous, 3 ayes, moving Bill number 23-102 to the full council. Next up, presentation, the city manager's presentation of general fund and public safety sales tax fund budgets and expansions. Mr. City Manager Mark Dunning.
Thank you, Chairman. Tomorrow, as I pull up the PowerPoint here, just as the agenda title reads, this is the focus on the general fund budget and the public safety sales tax budget. Those two budgets predominant, well, for this evening. So this is really the first that the committee has seen, other than general fund revenues, some predictions along the way, or some estimates along the way on what we're planning for general fund revenues. This will combine it all. It'll combine revenue projections, our expenditures, our budget requests, things of that nature for the general fund, which is our most flexible funding source. So there's a lot of attention to detail paid with our general fund for that reason. We'll follow that up with our first prepared budget for our public safety sales tax. And so we'll kind of compartmentalize these, focus first on the general fund, and then move into the public safety sales tax portion of this budget presentation. The other funds that the city has will be presented on June 5th, and I've got a timeline in here that will help show that. So I wanted to start first with kind of our presentation agenda. We certainly want to be mindful of our strategic plan, not only the city's, the community's strategic plan, but departmental strategic plans and things of that nature, and our core values as we prepare the budget. Those are the key documents we take guidance from. I think it's appropriate to look at a historical review of our budgets to see what information and data we can glean from those as we prepare for the fiscal year 24 budget. We'll certainly look at our general fund expansion needs and go through those with you and our budget details. And then, like I said, eventually get to public safety sales tax. So I'll kick things off and get partway through this presentation. I'll turn it over to Eric Stoyanov and Rick Gentry, who are part of our budget team here, and then you'll have the opportunity to hear from Chief Forbes and Chief Snyder on the public safety sales tax, and then I'll wrap up. So that's kind of what this presentation's going to look like for you. Here you can see this is our 2019 Ignite strategic plan, and what kind of the framework from that is what we call our critical success factors. These 7 critical success factors then are broken down into implementation strategies. They have objectives and goals and things of that nature that we are trying to move the needle on. So as I mentioned, we want to be mindful of our strategic plan, our 7 critical success factors. There's an implementation plan that was done as part of that, and connect many of these, the services that we provide, the enhancements that we're looking to bring on board, the expansions that we're considering, should connect back as best we can to our strategic plan. In addition, our core values as an organization. We have a vision, mission, and some core values, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to argue with any of these as we prepare the budget. We want to be fiscally responsible in the sense of stewardship of the resources provided to us so that we can deliver quality services in a manner, and the integrity to me is that's the approach that we take in delivering those services. So those all connect in my mind back to this budget and the presentation of what you'll see tonight. From a timeline perspective, here we are at tonight giving the general fund and I'll just call it PSST, Public Safety Sales Tax budgets. Coming down the road then on June 5th is all the other department of all department and fund budgets. So we do have many other funds that will be presented. I think there's a slide later on in the slide deck on that, with the goal of having a public hearing at the city council level on June 13th. We would need to advertise for that public hearing, as is customary for a public hearing, and have first reading of the budget on that June 13th meeting, with adoption and second reading of the budget on June 20, to have a budget in place by the time the new fiscal year begins and on July 4th. And by the way, please feel free to ask questions as we go along the presentation. Happy to entertain those as they come to your mind. As I mentioned, we're focused on general fund this evening, most flexible fund that we have. You can see the other special funds that we'll get to on June 5th, special revenue funds, debt service funds, capital funds, enterprise funds, and what we call internal service funds. So those will be a focus for June 5th. Some of your questions may relate to those. We'll be prepared to answer them, but a lot more focus will be placed on those funds at the June 5th meeting. So here's our look back. What can we glean from past budgets here? I'll use some footnotes here. Knowing that when we had fiscal year 20 actuals, we were in COVID times, and there was a lot of uncertainty during that budget. Same holds true for fiscal year 21 actuals. We were still in COVID. We were seeing substantial disruptions in supply chains, cost increases, things of that nature through those budgets. We also, I believe in fiscal year 21, we had anticipated a 10% decrease in sales taxes, just again, trying to be conservative. So I guess what I'm telling you is, as we look at this historical data, it's not like things were stable. there were a lot of footnotes, if I'll call them, caveats to some of those budgets. Now, coming through those two fiscal year budgets, you can see in fiscal year '22, we still came at that budget very conservatively. What we experienced in fiscal year '22 budget was the labor market certainly changed, more competitive, so we did have quite a few vacancies during that budget. In addition to that, then, our revenues were pretty impressive. So we had, as we budgeted, we were conservative. So a combination of vacancies predominantly, vacancies and revenues coming in stronger than anyone would have anticipated. Those are two of the big reasons why you can see that net change there of 14 million that went to the general fund reserve. I would also tie supply chain types of issues with that, where we fully anticipate to order things such as vehicles, and they're just not available. So, you know, that goes into this mix as well. So the story that I'm trying to help communicate here is it's good data to look back, but we got to think of what times were we in as we were going through that budget, because it's not just things were different back then, and they're different today. So those are some of the caveats I'd share with you. And then you can see in what we're estimating for finishing fiscal year '23. I can tell you that the original budget, we had budgeted $89.75 million as the budget, with utilization of about $1.4 million for what we call one-time expenditures out of the general fund reserve at that time. So as you, and I'll say we've done 15 budget amendments since the adoption of that budget. So that's why you see these numbers changed. And I'm a firm believer that the budget is a plan, and you should amend that as things become clearer and you go throughout the year, and your priorities may change. So here's what we're estimating for fiscal year '23, $92 million in revenues. You can see the expenditures and net transfers there, which are more than 92 million, but as we prepared that budget, as I mentioned, we figured 1.4 million out of general fund reserve. Right now, that it's 1.5 is what we're showing, and these are estimates. We do not actually know, and Betty would share this with you, until we do our audit our financials, which is after the fiscal year. So these are our best guesses at this point, based on the data that we have available. You see the box down below, the fund balance as of June 30, 2022, per our audited financials is $48.2 million. Now, our general fund reserve policy would tell us that we need to maintain 16.67% in general fund reserve. So as you can see, we're well above that. And I recall doing this presentation to the committee and to the council last year that we needed to have a discussion about our general fund reserve, and you'll see in my very last slide that I'll say that again. Those are opportunities to use general fund reserve for the good of the community. So that's where things sit right now. If you were to take and apply our policy to the policy ties back to the prior fiscal year, whether operating revenues or operating expenses were greater, the 16.67% should be tied to that prior fiscal year, whichever of those were greater. So in this case, if we looked at fiscal year '23, if these numbers were to come in as they're shown on the screen, that'd be the 92 million. And that would, if you apply the 16.67% to that, that would tell us we need 15.3 million, 15.4 million in general fund reserve to maintain that policy. So there's opportunities there. I think it's important to note our modernization of revenue sources as well. And again, this kind of creates some of the challenges to look at that historical data because things aren't the same. We've certainly brought on the use tax, the 10 cent in the debt levy reallocation to operating, the half-cent public safety sales tax, and just recently, the marijuana tax. So I call this modernizing our revenue streams. COVID certainly, as I mentioned, played a role in that. Labor market's playing a role. So as we modernize our revenue sources, there's a lot of other things on the expenditure side that has created some challenges to really model things in a fairly predictable way moving forward. So I did want to recognize that as we put the budget together. Okay, we'll focus now in on one-time general fund needs, and I mentioned one-time here because in the past, at least the past 3 or 4 budgets, we've looked at opportunities for one-time needs and considered finding a way to either fund those through excess revenues that came in the prior year or general fund reserve. So we took a similar approach as we put this budget together. Again, I'll start connecting back to our 7 critical success factors, strategic plans, as we go through these and expansion requests. We have a fleet, I'll call them, of AEDs, and we felt that it is time to replace those AEDs. Those have a shelf life to them, and technology changes. So you can see 59,500 in our AED replacement. Our rescue boat, we have 1 boat in our fleet in the fire department. And that is a boat that it works, but is it a boat that really will meet our needs for the lake community that we live in today's world? You can see it's a substantial enhancement from the boat that we have in our, we call it a vehicle equipment replacement program. This would be above and beyond those funds that are in that replacement program to acquire a boat that would better meet our standards and needs of today. You'll see later on in our PSST presentation that there would be another boat, because that was part of our PSST package, that would match this boat. So we want to find equipment that are equivalent as we use equipment within our emergency services departments. So that's a significant enhancement of an existing resource that we have. And that's part of the reason why it's here in the general fund. I'll share with you kind of on that point, kind of the philosophy about preparing our general fund and our public safety sales tax fund requests. I tend to think that if we've had this equipment or these programs in place, those are existing programs or equipment that we plan for and budget for replacement for out of the general fund generally. And if they're what I'll call a new program or the addition of equipment and things of that nature, then look into PSST to fund that. So I wanted to take pause there to mention with you generally the approach that we took with this budget, since PSST is new to this budget. Outdoor warning sirens, we have them. Again, that's not new. This would be a replacement of our outdoor warning siren system. So that's in the general fund at this point. The compensation review and analysis is intentionally written that way. It does not say a compensation study. We did that back in, 18, maybe 19, 2018 or 2019, and that was a very in-depth compensation and benefit study. This is more along the lines of, let's go check market, given how volatile things have been, the job market, how competitive things have been. And so this is $75,000 to use some outside party. We know that Mid-America Regional Council collects compensation data, so we could use them, but let's have some input in looking at where are we at with market. So it's not a full-fledged compensation and benefit study. It's more of a review and analysis just to kind of check in on what has changed in the labor market. The next 4 are more tied to overall maintenance of the city. Looking for a utility vehicle with a spray tank as we maintain our right-of-ways. A vehicle of that nature could be more effective and efficient for us than a larger piece of equipment, more adaptable to certain areas of town where we have the responsibility to maintain property. A rather large one, a pavement milling machine. The machine we have is fairly limited, especially in the width that it can mill. It may work great for sidewalks and little spot repairs. But as we continue to add pavement, this could create great efficiencies for us in our operations of maintaining roadways and other things of that nature. 16-foot trailer, self-explanatory, that'd be an additional 16-foot trailer, and 2 half-ton pickups for positions that I think relate to some of our expansion requests here, and then generally throughout general fund enhancements to some of our computers, monitors, and things of that nature in moving forward. So we would consider now some of these, like the utility vehicles, the milling machine, to some extent the trailer, the pickups, there's some VERP funding that we start putting away so that when it comes time to replace those pieces of equipment, so to say they're truly one-time is, I'll put that in quote, kind of parentheses there, because there is some minimal cost to some of these, but that initial purchase could be made through one-time costs. And you can see the personnel equipment there that we can consider one-time costs too, related to expansion requests, and we get almost to $1 million in what we would consider one-time expenses as we put this budget together. Some other expansion needs, these would have, in my mind, have some recurring costs. So we've been working on the diversity and inclusion, working with the Diversity and Inclusion Commission to bring forward recommendations. You'll be hearing from them tomorrow evening at the council meeting with a status report on their work. We need to be planning for resources and things in that sense to continue that work. That's one of the conditions of their work, is that as they prepare those recommendations, the city manager shall bring forward a fiscal report on what it would take to implement some of those recommendations. So this is a little bit in advance of their report, just knowing that we need to be mindful of that. So there's $50,000 in the budget for that. Heard from many of you who attended some of our efforts down at Jefferson City and in Washington, D.C. about enhancing our lobbyist services. There's $75,000 in the budget for that. That would not be an FTE here at the city. That would be utilizing lobbyist services in those respective areas to make those connections, enhance those connections with our respective legislators. You can see an ambulance fleet replacement lease here. You may recall with we call this our yellow fleet. Chief Snyder has put in motion a lease program for, I'll call them ladder trucks and pumpers. This would be doing a very similar program for our ambulances. And again, that brings consistency to that fleet from the sense of maintenance, and you think of the staff that's operating that equipment. He calls it muscle memory. You realize, everything's the same regardless of which piece of equipment you're using, so there's uniformity in those, so this would be a similar approach to that. Defibrillator lease program, $250,000. We call these our life packs. We have a fleet of those again. This would bring consistency to those devices, and there is ongoing, I'll call it maintenance and upgrades that are connected to that lease program, so that as those devices need upgrades or maintenance, those are within that program itself. Right now, we just acquire them, they're ours, and then we have to have those serviced, if you will. And the last two items there are new Station 4 and new Station 5. We need to plan for connectivity for those new stations, and that's what you see there within that fiber lease for those two facilities. So those are more urgent needs as those facilities come online. So you can see $524,000 in those expansion category. So here's expansion needs with recurring expenses. And I'll again try to tie these back to critical success factors here. Right now we have a cultural arts division of one, that is Glenda Masters. She does yeoman's work on all things cultural arts right now. We're trying to, as the strategic plan would tell us, continue to grow cultural arts within the community. So there's a cultural arts specialist, FTE being requested in the budget. That the amounts that you see there are also include not only just the salary and benefits, but then computers, things of that nature that would be needed if those personnel were to be approved. You get a marketing specialist there in our creative services division. All things communicate. If you think of all things communication, public engagement that the city does, that's a team, I believe, of 5 right now that we started, I'm going to say back in maybe 2015 or so, growing that environment with all the different, I call them vehicles that we use to engage the public and internally and externally and with our community partners. That would be an additional resource for that team. That ties back to community engagement, critical success factor in the strategic plan. With our HR department looking for an additional resource in an HR generalist. We are doing a lot of recruitment and hiring at this point, and we will continue to do that. When you see some of the public safety sales tax initiatives, a lot of those are personnel related. So there is a large amount of work taking place in the HR environment, so an additional resource is being requested there, and I tie that back to our gosh, it just escaped me. City services and infrastructure, right? To have staff on to deliver the services that we would like to deliver. The benefit specialist, you see an asterisk, and that's only a half FTE. This is succession planning is what this relates to. We do have an employee who plans to retire, and in doing so, that's a pretty key position where you want to have that institutional knowledge transitioned over to a new resource. So that one is not necessarily recurring. That's why the asterisk is by it, just to get through some succession planning and a transition in that respect. A grants manager is a position that, again, tying back to the trip to Jeff City and Washington, D.C., we do not have somebody dedicated to be a grant manager who could be out there looking for grant opportunities and helping the city manage all of those grants. So you can see an amount, an FTE, an amount that we would hope to bring on a grant manager for the city. Probation officer there, this would be an additional probation officer. If you see down below, I'll connect these two together, there'd be that's probation officer in municipal courts. We have seen an increase in the amount of probations being ordered, and so the data would suggest we need another probation officer in order to be mindful of what's coming out of the municipal court so that they are remaining compliant. Those are not connected. Lead detention officer down there is a reclassification. I'll just hit it since I mentioned it. That's a reclassification to have a lead detention officer. An EMS assistant chief at $50,000, that is not what we pay our assistant chiefs. That would be the increment needed to promote someone to an EMS assistant chief. Again, tying back to our philosophy in approaching PSST, promotions to, in this case, to a chief, that would likely be somebody within our ranks that gets promoted. And then what happens is then you're bringing on a new firefighter as folks slide into different spots. So that new firefighter you'll see tucked into the PSST. So what you see there is that increment to promote. A CID resident inspector, so as much capital projects that we have going on, we could use another inspector. I would note that that position is funded through reimbursements as we do our capital projects. So we do budget for it in our general fund, but you should know that there's a revenue stream that comes in and replenishes that position. Within our Public Works Department, an applications analyst that would help with all of the different applications and technology that Public Works uses. And then 4 operators within Public Works. What those would entail is predominantly right-of-way maintenance activities. And we've seen what can happen if you don't stay on top of right-of-way maintenance, as we've experienced it with some of our MoDOT corridors. So we have that opportunity to bring on 4 operators to stay on top of our right-of-way maintenance. And as we continue to build new streets and infrastructure within the city, bringing on another crew makes a lot of sense. So that ties back to city services and infrastructure as well. And you can see the total fund personnel expansion needs there just over $1 million. Okay, here's generally those expansion needs or enhancements, I'll call them. One time, almost $1 million non-personnel that we covered, plus the personnel, we're at $2.5 million on expansions or enhancements is the way I call them. So from our current budget, that's what that looks like. Okay, so what does all this mean? Here you can see, again, a look at history, and then compared to what we're projecting for fiscal year '23, and then what we're budgeting for in fiscal year '24. And at this point, I think I will, well, I know I will turn it over to Eric Stoyanov to go through these numbers. But as you can see at the bottom, the revenues are the key takeaways down there to see where we've been and what we feel we would put together for fiscal year '24. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eric.
Good afternoon, Eric Stoyanov, Budget Manager. So as Mark said, we're going to go on the revenue side. Most of these numbers you've kind of seen last month. We've been making a few tweaks as we got new data in, largely the same, but we'll go through in more detail in the coming slides. Bottom line, the total revenue amount is up 2.4% compared to where we expect FY23, but again, dive a little bit more into the detail coming up. So this takes where we expect to end FY23 and then our budget amount for FY24 and shows the change in both dollar terms and in percentage change. And so as you can see, property tax, we have about 5% growth is what we're projecting. Sales tax and motor vehicle tax, we're still projecting pretty solid growth in those two categories. Franchise tax and then the other tax and other revenue, those areas we do see a little bit of a decline coming. But overall, the total revenue figure up about 2.4%. I should mention too, the other revenue, that's the category that's comprised of fines and forfeitures, investment earnings, permits, things like that, intergovernmental transfers. And other taxes, the cigarette tax and then the intangible tax. And so we'll dive into a little bit more now. This is in visual format, just so you can see what our largest revenue drivers are. Property tax, sales tax, and franchise tax make up over 70% of our revenues. You can see we're getting decent growth. Those numbers keep going up. As far as motor vehicle, other tax, other revenue, those fluctuate a little bit, but relatively stay the same. Where we're seeing our most growth over the past few years is definitely property tax, sales tax, and the franchise tax areas. And again, feel free to stop me at any point to ask questions. So on the property tax side, we get our property taxes from Jackson County and Cass County. By far, it's Jackson County is our biggest percentage. We also get a replacement tax. If you're unfamiliar with the replacement tax, it's a little bit of a weird one, but it's a tax on manufacturers' tangible inventory. So we get a percentage based on our proportion of manufacturer, wholesaler inventory. Right now, with our current assessments, all we've gotten is our Jackson County preliminary assessments showing an 18% jump. We're permitted either the lower of actual growth, CPI, or 5%. So for this fiscal year, we're going to be 5% because CPI is definitely higher than that. So that's basically what we're going with our property tax projection. We haven't gotten new construction yet for Jackson County as part of our preliminary assessment, but we feel comfortable going with the 5%. As far as replacement tax, we've seen about a 6% growth. This budget's a little bit less than that, so we went a little bit more on the conservative side. Pilots has stayed relatively consistent, which brings our total property tax category to $28.8 million, which is about just under a 5% growth compared to where we expect to end FY23.
Hang on a second.
Yep.
Councilmember Edson has a question.
I'm sorry, Eric, I'm not understanding. I guess I'm not understanding why you are estimating the property tax increase to be so much smaller than what we're hearing. Revenues from the property tax.
Yeah, so we're permitted, it's based on our levy calculation, we're permitted the lower of the actual growth, what our CPI is, or 5%. CPI, what the county gave us is 6.5%, actual valuation is 18%, so our permitted growth in that category for reassessment growth is the 5%. And so that's where we're going with the 5%.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Yep.
Chair.
Good, okay. So sales tax, another large category and definitely our most variable category. One we keep very close eye on every single month to check for any fluctuations because as we all know, there's been a lot of talk about recessions and slowdowns and spending drops. And so every month we check it as soon as we can to look for any early trends so that we're aware and can respond to it. So far, we've been fortunate and we haven't noticed any significant downtrends, but definitely one we keep an eye on since it's such a large proportion of our revenue drivers. And again, we went relatively, right now, I think we're at 6.7% growth year to date for FY23. For FY24, for the sales tax portion, we're going just over 3%. That sales tax number does include our marijuana tax projection. We just didn't break it out because there's so few marijuana retailers currently, and so we didn't want to divulge that information publicly. But that number is baked into the sales tax total. EATS, as you're all familiar with, the economic activity taxes, so that's associated with the TIF projects. And then the use tax. So use tax really, it was implemented, really took off. We're seeing huge growth. This year, it's kind of started to taper off a little bit. I think right now we're at 5.7% up year to date. In previous years, we've been in the high double digits with that. So this FY24 budget takes into account kind of how we're seeing a little bit of a leveling off. And so we're just projecting slightly above 4% for growth for our use tax, which brings our total for sales tax category to 26.39. And here's a historical perspective. So you can see from 17 to 18, sales tax as a category grew 4.5% roughly. Same story from 18 to 19. 20, we were kind of relatively flat. And then in 21 and 22, we saw huge growth in this category. From FY21 to FY22, we saw 22% growth. That was when the use tax really started picking up. FY22 to 23, FY20 to 21, 17% growth again. This year, as a category, we're about at 4.5%, so we're kind of getting back to where we were before the use tax was implemented. So kind of a leveling off, still growth, but kind of a leveling off. And so same story with FY24. We're expecting about 4.3% growth in this category. And you can kind of see, while our sales tax has gone up, it's really those new taxes that have caused the high growth in this category with the marijuana tax coming online this year. Franchise tax, comprised of natural gas, telephone, electric cable. This one, we have two ascending groups and two descending groups. So natural gas and electric, we've been seeing strong growth, especially natural gas with the rate hikes that they had this year. We've been above 30% with our growth year to date. Electric's still been growing, not as high as natural gas, but then telephone and cable, they've been dropping off for years. This year in particular, the decline has gotten steeper. And so that's caused this category to, our projection is that it's gonna drop just about 0.5% as a category as a whole, because we expect now that these rate hikes are kind of baked in that we're still gonna grow with natural gas, but we only put in about an 8% growth compared to the 30 plus that we've been seeing this year. And as you can see at the bottom with that table, this is kind of what we've been seeing in the past years. So we've had as many negative years as positive years in the franchise tax category. So it's one that definitely fluctuates. It's not just ascending all the way up. And again, a visual representation, you can clearly see electric, natural gas on the rise, which is good because those are our biggest revenue drivers. But telephone and cable, those declines have become pretty steep. Cable in particular is down 20-something%. Telephone's down, I think, 30% this year. So we've seen a substantial drop-off. Motor vehicle tax revenue, so fuel tax again is going to be going up from 22 cents a gallon to 24.5 cents a gallon July 1st. So that's one of the reasons we definitely see the fuel tax continuing to go up. Motor vehicle sales tax was a little bit harder. We've seen pretty strong growth in this category this year, but as we know, interest rates have been rising, credit's getting a little tighter. I think there's still a few inventory challenges. And I know auto manufacturers have been warning about a little bit of a slowdown. And so We've gone pretty conservative with just under 2% growth for FY '24, just because there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the motor vehicle sales tax category. License fee, that's pretty much gone up by about 4 to 5% every year, and that's roughly in line with what we're projecting for FY '24 to continue. And then here's that other revenue category we spoke about. It's comprised of fines and forfeitures, licenses and permits, investment earnings, charges for service. That's the 10.3 million. The largest driver of that is pretty much our ambulance fees. I think are about 8 million of that 10 million. A significant change that's happened since the last time we spoke is we went back to our investment earnings and looked a little closer at that because we were in the negative for our investment earnings, but as you know, there's the inverse relationship between interest rates and bond prices, and so we had, with the interest rates rising significantly, we've had our mark-to-market, every year we mark-to-market our portfolio, and so we've been seeing declines in our mark-to-market as those steep interest rate increases have been happening, which is why in FY '22 we almost had a negative $1 million in our investment earnings. But now it seems like we've kind of hit that top level and maybe could even see rates declining in FY '24. And so we went back and looked at our mark-to-market calculation and changed it a little bit. So that's been a little bit of a change. We expect to finally dip into the positive after having some significant negative years, which again, we hold most of our securities until maturity, so it's more of a paper transaction than actually impacting us, but it's something that we have to include. And then, yeah, overall, another one is the licenses and permits. Most of those forecasts have been slashed that have related to single-family developments have been slashed by 50% just because we've seen a significant slowdown, in particular in single-family. So that's part of the big decrease in the licenses and permits portion. Everything else is relatively in line with what we've been seeing in recent years, which brings us to that 20.5 million total for the other revenue. And as you can see in this slide, since FY '20, we've pretty much hovered between that $19 to $20 million range. Some years we go up a little bit, some years we go down a little bit, but it's never huge increases or huge decreases. It kind of just keeps fluctuating in that range. And then I'll turn it over to Rick unless you guys have questions about any of the revenues.
Any questions?
All right,
All right, thank you, Eric.
thanks.
Good evening, Rick Gentry, Budget Manager. I was moving from the revenues now onto the expense side, and this is just going to be a pretty high-level look at the expenditures for the general fund as we go forward here in this presentation this evening. On the screen you see before you again, it's got historical look back as we've been doing on the other areas. Looking back to FY '21 and FY '22 actuals and our '23 budget and the FY '23 projections. Those were provided when we did our mid-year projections, and we brought forth a budget amendment and did some increased some authorization in some areas that needed additional authorization. And personnel services, that it was an area that actually went down about $2.5 million, is because of vacancy savings and other things that were occurring in the environment and finding personnel. So going across there, the top line personnel services, that includes is not only salaries, but the benefits, health insurance and loggers, are the largest parts of the personnel services other than the salaries. Supplies for resale, those are the things that we have in our ambulance fleet that are reusable or consumed by patient usage, such as the oxygen, various medical supplies, and then the items we sell out in the Lee Summit store out and through the Treasury. Other supplies, material service charges, it's a large group of our purchases. It encompasses many accounts. That's their supplies, materials, office supplies, professional services are all lumped in there together with other supplies and services. Repairs and maintenance, those are accounts that are specific to repairs and maintenance of equipment or facilities. Utilities, those are utilities, and these are just the ones out of the general fund. As we get to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about rates and increases there. So that's all electric, natural gas, mainly in water and sewer. Fuel, lubricants, that's pretty self-explanatory as we go across there. And, the fuel, lubricants for our vehicles, Capital outlay, those capital outlay will fluctuate from year to year depending on the needs of the city and the departments. The capital outlay in FY '21, you see there, that was when we were doing the remodel of the PD and courts. They spent some asset forfeiture funds to help contribute towards the PD remodel, as well as I think we had some expenditures related to the camera program that was being implemented at that time as well. FY '22, that expense was capitalization of leases for equipment and buildings as required for GASB 87. This year, see a big significant drop there in FY '23 down to 22,000. I think our actuals are up a little bit more than that as we've purchased a couple of pieces of equipment with funds that were available because of vacancy savings. As we move forward to next year, you can see it goes back up. Interdepartmental changes, those we'll see at the June 5th meeting. That's our internal service funds with central billing services, IT, and fleet management. And then the transfers out. Again, those fluctuate from year to year depending on the needs and things we might need to address. In FY '21, you see a significant amount went to the Green Street project. And that was a transfer from money we'd accumulated over years for sale of property. So that was money was transferred over to Green Street for the purchase of property over there. FY '22, that was pretty much a normal year for us. Each year, we have the public safety equipment replacement program. That's police and fire transferring money to that fund. So that transfer is included in each one of those years, as well as transfers to fleet when they do expansion requests. Those fleet transfers are included, as well as to IT. FY '22, we had the transfer of the $500,000 to the stormwater fund to do that study at that time. And then FY '23, we had some large transfers that were mentioned earlier with the insurance and claims damages fund to there, and to $4.2 million to the government, general government capital projects fund, as dedicated funds for one of the fire station projects, as well as the legacy blast. That was with legacy blast be on pause for the last couple of years. That transfer is included as well in there in the past years. So looking at FY '23 to FY '24 comparisons, personnel charges are up 8.6%, and that's compared to the projections. It's much closer to about 6% with the actuals, or I'm sorry, off the budgeted number we had in FY '23. And again, that mostly includes the salaries and benefits and the expansion request in there. Supplies and resales, small increase just because the cost of additional materials and supplies have gone up. Supplies and services gone up 7%. Repairs and maintenance, we've seen an increase since FY '21, an increase of 69%. There's several contracted services, and we're running into not only supply chain issues, but a lot of our vendors run into those same issues, being able to hire the staff that they need because they are competing, so a lot of the costs have increased for those as well. And those are reflected in our budgets. Miscellaneous, over the last couple of years, we've kind of whittled a lot of the miscellaneous things are out of there. This is primarily consist of now the 465 in this year's budget is about 350,000 of that's for the GEMT payment. So to get our reimbursement, we actually pay into the to that project. And then through the calculation and our submission of our report, and then we receive our payment back, and then we see that on the revenue side. So that payment has gone up gradually each year, so that's an increase there. And the other part of the miscellaneous are the discretionary accounts for the council and the mayor. Capital outlay, you see that increase going up this next year, and that is including the lease payments for the yellow fleet for fire. That's for the ambulance payment that you saw in the expansion request, as well as the pumper payment. We'll make I think it's an interest-only payment out of this next fiscal year. So that's included in that capital outlay amount. Interdepartment charges are going up, and then our transfers, you can see, going down significantly, but that's just the transfers out, or for those, again, legacy blast, the PSERP, and then the fleet and IT expansions for the equipment for those expansion positions. Personnel being our biggest component of the budget. So what's included inside the increases this year? We are doing a increase, recommending increase of payment of 6% to core general employees. And while we're doing that simultaneously, we're going to do a 2% increase to the pay bands, the top and bottom of those pay bands. So employees will all see a 6% increase in the core general. Those that will hit out the max, I think there'll be about a 2% increase or 2 or 3% they may miss out depending on where they are today. We do, in this budget, we did include going ahead and giving them the full 6%, and they're reassured to get that through '24, and then if it's available in future years, that's up to future budgets. The budget does include the agreements, or the increase for the labor groups for police, fire, and IAM, so those increases are included in the budget. General fund personnel expansions that Mr. Dunning went over earlier, that $1 million for those expansions are included in these personnel numbers that you see presented. Expanded public safety group, per the state legislature, expanded by definition. Anytime we make a change in loggers, that has to happen at the state level. The legislature has to pass those changes. So they did add the communication staff and the detention staff of police to the public safety group, and they fall under that qualifications. So that increase takes them from the core general group, which is be at 10.3%, to their reimbursement, or sorry, their loggers percentage goes up to 15.1%, which is in line with the police rate for under public safety. And then the presentation numbers also includes an increase of 10% in health insurance costs for this next year, and 5%, we know that's under contract, we have a 5% increase coming next year. We've been fortunate the last 2 years, 3 years, that our increase in health insurance has only been around 6%. But we never know when that's going to change. We did include a 10% increase in there for health insurance. Now, overall, in the general fund, as you can see, the personnel is our largest expense, to making about 67% of our budget, the general fund. 15% of that goes to the supplies and materials, and then 10% of our internal services. So roughly those three items, personnel, internal services, which a large part of their budget is personnel as well, and our supplies and materials and professional services makes up over 90% of our budget on the general fund side. So as you can see from Eric's section, our revenues are going to be $95,145,083 projected. Expenses at this time are projected to be $95,461,284. Under policy, we're allowed to spend down general fund if we have identified one-time expenditures. And Mr. Dunning showed on the expansion list, we had over $900,000 of one-time expenditures we identified. So we're going to use $316,000 of those to bring our budget down to where we'll be in balance at this time. Any questions?
Any questions?
All right, I'll turn it back over to Mr. Dunning.
Thank you, Rick.
Okay, committee, that gets us through the general fund, high-level review of the general fund budget. And so we'll transition into the first public safety sales tax budget that we have put together. And you can see on the screen there, it's the half-cent public safety sales tax. We are taking a very similar approach to preparing this budget in that there are going to be what we'll call one-time costs within this budget, but there will also be ongoing recurring expenses because there's personnel within this budget. So as we prepare this budget, we want to be mindful of that and build up a reserve, much like we do for the general fund. Now, we currently don't have a public safety sales tax reserve policy, but that's something that we should be mindful of and work towards as we put these budgets together. So as you see on this slide here, we're anticipating more revenue than we currently are planning for in expenses intentionally so that we can build up that reserve. So we're giving you the picture of the revenues and expenses right up front just to help express that that's the way we've approached this, to try to build up a reserve. Now, to what level, to be determined yet. We'd need to have some policy discussions on that, but we intentionally put this budget together in that fashion. With that, we'll we'll ask Chief Forbes to come up and cover the police portion of this, and then Chief Snyder will follow up, and then I'll wrap up again. So thank you.
Chair, committee members, Travis Forbes, the Chief of Police. First, I'll just say that you'll see through what we're going to discuss for the police portion of the public safety tax that it all stays very much within what we presented to the public just not that long ago, that we had the plans that we had for spending these funds. I also appreciate the fact that the city's focus is on new items that add to policing services in the city as opposed to funding previously existing items. It's really helped us enhance public safety services in Lee Summit. We also have to prioritize needs, and I think you'll see that reflected in the choices that we made or the plans that we have for next year. And quite frankly, we'll start out looking at some personnel issues. I would like to hire even more than what is reflected on this slide, but we're being a bit realistic. It's very challenging to hire in this environment for police, but also for pretty much any sector of government that I've seen, or even the private sector. It's challenging to hire in these current circumstances. So as much as I'd like to hire even more police officers than are reflected on this slide, and we're trying to be very realistic about it. We are currently 9 police officers short out of a total of 160 authorized. So we have to hire those as well. I'll start out with communication specialists. This was reflected in a study we did on public service communications just a few years ago from an organization called Mission Critical Partners that looked at both police and fire communications. They recommended that we increase staffing. So these 4 FTEs that you see reflected here is a byproduct of that to implement some of what they recommended through that independent study. A senior crime analyst fits within our effort to use intelligence-led policing and evidence-based policing practices, proven practices to combat crime. This would actually be a civilian position. I've told Mr. Dunning that one of the positions I'm asked about most since I was hired here was, do you have any civilian crime analyst positions? Because we have a lot of people who want to do that kind of work. And currently we have 2 crime analyst positions, but they're both sworn. So this would create our first civilian crime analyst and also give a career ladder to some of our civilian employees. The 3 FTEs you see for police officer are for our crime reduction team. We had talked about doubling the crime reduction team in our discussions to the public about the public safety sales tax. And this is a step in that direction to hire enough officers to actually do that. Currently, our CRT team only works 4 days a week, so this would expand our staffing to allow 7 days a week coverage. Crime doesn't take days off, so we can't really either. The evidence and property technician, Deputy Chief Bunker and I were talking before the meeting. It's been about 5 or 6 years ago that we had 2 property and evidence technicians. We reduced that to 1, kind of robbed Peter to pay Paul. We can't really remember what we did that for, but we've kind of felt it. We need to have a second property and evidence technician back. We are processing more evidence and property than before, so this would restore that position essentially through the public safety sales tax funding. And animal control officer, we're just seeing more and more animal control calls. It would provide us more coverage as well to respond to those calls. As our population grows, people bring their pets with them and such, so they need more services, and this is just meeting those needs as they expand. Now we're moving on to stuff as opposed to people, and we start out by looking at an annual wellness assessment. This is something that is both required by law now, but also something that we wholeheartedly agree with and see a lot of value in. Essentially, the state passed a statute a couple years ago that requires a mental health check-in for officers every 3 years, and we are going to do that every 2 years. And also, we are going to implement a health check too. So the fire department currently does this. We don't do it for police officers yet, but this would allow us to do a physical on our officers and hopefully identify issues before they become serious problems down the road and get our folks on the path to better health. So that's what that's about. Virtual reality training system is something that was discussed in our public presentations too, to be able to put officers into any situation you can dream of and test their reaction skills. When I started in law enforcement way back in the day, we had these, and they were essentially shoot, don't shoot kind of video scenarios, but they've really come a long way. Now they help officers practice de-escalation techniques and how they talk to people and things of that nature. So that's the type of system that we're looking at implementing. We're currently doing quite a bit of research to make sure we get the right product that works very well. Jail camera migration, basically when we redid the training center, we added the training center and the jail on to the police department. It's probably been close to 10 years ago now. The jail camera system that we put in doesn't really meet the modern standards of the cameras that we're using throughout the city, so this would bring them up to the same standards and so they can integrate with, that's what we're kind of doing as the city, and ITS supports that too. We want every camera that the city uses to kind of be on the same system, so they're all integrated. We've talked at length about the license plate reader system in discussions about the potential for the ordinance to change, but this would implement license plate readers in parts of the city where the crime rate has indicated we could use them most. I just attended a police chiefs conference about a week and a half ago and talked with several regional chiefs, and they called these systems a game changer. They essentially said if they have a violent crime, these systems have been extremely helpful in the subsequent investigations and addressing those issues. So we're hoping for very similar results here in Lee Summit. Bomb robot, we talked in management team about a sexier name for that, but that's essentially what it is. This is a robot that we use for our explosive ordnance disposal team. In the past, we had a pretty good source of federal funding to replace the bomb robots. That's kind of dried up and gone away, so there's a need to replace it currently. We also use it sometimes for inserting in a barricaded subject situation where we want to get a view of the room. Instead of putting a human in there and putting them in harm's way, we'll use the robot sometimes to look around too. So we use it for various scenes, but it's really for explosive ordnance disposal. Rather than sending a human up there, we send the robot. Crime scene mapping and 3D scanner is pretty cool stuff. It essentially, you put it in the middle of a crime scene and it creates a 3D visual map that you can use for court or investigative purposes later. If you want to revisit the crime scene, you can do it virtually these days instead of having to go back there and view it with human eyes. So this would give us that capability or upgrade. And then the firearm range, unfortunately, again, about 10 years ago, we built a training unit with a great firearms range working very well, except the software vendor that provides the software for that range went out of business and is no longer available, so upgrades are non-existent, and this would basically convert to a different system from a vendor who's more reliable and still in business today, so we can continue to use our range the way it's intended. And finally, the last line item, if you go back to the previous slide, is all the equipment and supplies needed for those folks on that prior slide for them to do their jobs appropriately. So that is it for the police department. Unless you have questions, I can pass it to Chief Snyder.
Anybody have any questions for Chief Forbes? Councilmember Edson.
Well, I just want to, those are all really neat items, so I want to see what Snyder comes up with. See if he can keep pace.
I'm pretty certain they're not quite as neat, but we'll see.
I don't think he's going to be able to top that, frankly.
Thank
He
you.
just wants a boat, so.
Thank you.
Where to start? So, Chair, members of the committee, Mike Snyder, Fire Chief, and I think I heard the statement over here on the not-so-neat front. I'll continue with my presentation today. In front of you, I'll echo Chief Forbes' statement. A majority of these items were items that were presented in our educational opportunities with the citizens as we preceded the elections. The 13 FTEs here today, the 12 of them represent the expansion of our first fire apparatus since 2007. It would be our intentions to, if you recall, we moved through this committee and requested authorization for those FTEs already. This is the budget side of those, but that authorization is allowing us to move through the hiring process to get those individuals hired with a tentative date of July 11th or July 10th. So we will bringing on those 12 personnel. It takes us about 3 to 4 months to onboard staff and train them in most scenarios. So our go-live date is anticipated to be November 1st for that expansion fire apparatus. Today, we would look at locating them out of station number 3, which was designed to house more than one fire apparatus. As we move into the future, I would anticipate a relocation of that down to station 1 when that facility is completed and done and several years down the road. But we're definitely set up to bring that on board today. Station 1 and 3 is really a toss-up based on call volume. Station 1 ultimately is my long-term goal, just due to location. The 13th person was already spoken to by Mr. Dunning. That is the actual FTE expansion that will allow us to promote other individuals to Assistant Chief of EMS. That's a continuation of separation of responsibilities that we began when I started. If you recall, when I started, Chief Manley was serving as the training chief, which also was responsible for emergency management and EMS. Those are three distinct separate items to be responsible for. We were able to, before COVID, very luckily, move his role and transition him to Assistant Chief of Emergency Management. And then the training chief still maintains the emergency medical services responsibility. This is going to allow that continuation of the separation of those functions. The $50,000 that was represented in the general fund that Mr. Dunning spoke to is not just for one promotion. When we promote one person from battalion to assistant, then we have to backfill the battalion, and then we're backfilling the captain's position as well. So that's covering that wide range of staff. We're anticipating that to go in line about the same time as that expansion fire apparatus, somewhere in the October-November time range, depending on how staff is released. As we move into the non-personnel side of the public safety sales tax for the fire department, the first item is really, we spoke to it through the process as analytical software. That's going to allow us to bring in the resources of our records management, our computer-aided dispatch, as well as our electronic patient care reports to better facilitate our data analysis through our accreditation process. We are looking at the First Watch software specifically because that's a regional platform that's being used. So this would be in use far beyond our walls, as it would allow our Fusion Center for Regional Homeland Security to also monitor certain incident types and be made aware of them as they go on. And that is the platform that they have chosen to use. The EMS chief staff vehicle, as Mr. Dunning spoke to, we really tried to look at what is new items and coming into the service versus the other. This vehicle, with that being an expansion position, has been placed in the public safety sales tax. EMS utility vehicle, actually very, very excited about this one. Unfortunately, it's probably going to come in a little bit more than what this is. We just got notified of some price increases on the vehicle themselves and some options. But today, we have 2 utility vehicles that we utilize for downtown events, for our trails, et cetera. If you're familiar with those are truly John Deere Gators with some stretchers on the back of them, and people are out in the open as they're being transported. This is going to allow us to have a vehicle within our system that could still provide that same UTV quality, but could provide that protection or privacy to that individual if we were transporting them through a largely populated area. So very excited to see that. Unfortunately, I don't believe that if approved, it would even show up this year. It is falling right in line with all of the other products that we're faced with, and we're looking at about a 16 to 18-month delivery on that based on information we know today. Ambulance equipment and technology, obviously we've just expanded an ambulance, or it will be going in service June 1. While we're using our reserve apparatus and equipment for that purpose now, as we bring that additional ambulance on board, we will need to purchase the additional equipment that goes hand in hand with that. We do not have a time frame on when those ambulances will be ordered. We ordered those 2 ambulances, if you recall, I believe last August, September. We still have no information on a delivery date at this point as they await chassis. Health and wellness equipment, I think, speaks for itself. That's to look to ensure that we are standardizing all of the equipment, replacing the equipment in the stations on a more regular frequency to ensure our personnel have the resources to stay physically fit. The radio communications in our subterranean area, that's one area that when we had our upgraded radio system, we still need to work through identifying potential solutions. We're still using the legacy equipment at that location, and we want to ensure that we can use the current upgraded radio system. Looking at several different options from bidirectional amplifiers, suitcase, items, et cetera. Fire and EMS Pro QA. For those that aren't aware, we do emergency medical dispatching from our communication center. The Fire EMS Pro QA is moving from the antiquated and old flip charts that we have today that honestly have not been supported from the company for many, many years into the up-to-date computerized version that does coordinate with our computer-aided dispatch system. If approved, we would look to make that purchase. I believe we actually have completed the RFP, so that would be implemented after we get our CAD upgrade implemented. So we would look at that to happen towards the end of this calendar year. Mr. Dunning spoke to the boat in the general fund presentation. You'll notice here, as he mentioned, that was only making up the difference. We have $18,000 in the VERP today, so that's why you saw the 142 versus, or 144 versus the 162 you see here. Looking at multiple vendors and just kind of giving you a reason why this is really necessary at this point, in my opinion. Today, we're operating about a 17, 18-foot John boat that really is maximized at three personnel, average size personnel. That does not allow for a victim, and it doesn't provide any additional resources that we could use throughout our community. Does that size of boat have a place in this community? Very much so. We have smaller lakes and pond areas that could assist in servicing if we would elect to keep it. In addition, it's, as I mentioned, it's at weight capacity. We cannot add any additional resources. We were attempting to add some technology that allows the boat to be stayed in one location, and it could not add the additional batteries to it. So we're beyond capacity with that. This is definitely looking at a larger boat, but still meets the requirements that we need within our area, as well as providing us additional resources, i.e. we're looking at a portable pump. We have no fire capabilities on the water today. A portable pump located on this, and when I say portable, it's truly fixed, but it's a portable resource, would be on this. This would allow 6 to 7 people to be on a boat, plus additional equipment and victims. So, and it's not much larger. It's only 20 foot, but it's built much better and much more sturdy and stable for that environment. Station alerting, it says heart safe because I say that multiple times. Today we're operating on basically radio amplifiers, speakers on an amplifier that come in louder as our tones go out to alert our personnel. We have definitely learned over the last several years and decades that if we can have a softer alert tone process to that it definitely provides some health benefits for our personnel. This station alerting system is much more technologically advanced than what we have today. It would be integrated within our computer-aided dispatch system, allowing as the communication specialist enters in that call, it would automatically start dispatching the staff. So while we'll get the health and safety benefits of it for our staff, we're also going to get quicker turnout times through these processes because it will not be a manual process, which it is today. So improving upon already great call processing times when it gets to alerting our staff will be a huge accomplishment through this process. Technical rescue and hazmat, those are other disciplines that we work on within the community in our response capabilities. As we look, we're continuing to look to improve that response capability. For instance, in our hazmat, we're technically right now working hand in hand with our neighbors at Central Jackson County Fire and Independence Fire, trying not to duplicate resources and ensuring that, equipment that we have isn't duplicating what's next door, et cetera. So we're very excited about those. And then technical rescue are our items. It's not just, high angle and low angle and stuff. That's extrication and everything else that goes hand in hand with that. So that really wraps up our non-personnel items and personnel.
Any questions? Councilmember.
Yeah, I just had a question about the rescue boat, because you mentioned that was something that was brought up earlier in the presentation, and I saw it was under the one-time general fund needs, and then also listed here. What's the total cost of the boat, and where are the different funding sources? I just wasn't clear.
Okay, so the first one is currently funded through that Mr. Dunning spoke to. There's $18,000 currently located in our vehicle and equipment replacement plan, so that's funding source one. The balance of that is currently being made up in the general fund presentation or proposal to you. This one is an additional boat. The plans are to deploy those. Today, we have one boat, very geographically, distant from all over in the city. So the plans are with New Station 4 and New Station 5 is to position these new boat and apparatus at those locations.
Okay, so you'd have two nice new boats, one for Raintree and one for Lakewood, basically.
I'll call it north and south. If you want to put lake names on it, that works as well.
Okay. Just that I'm clear in my head what's.
Yeah, and then the current boat that we have today, we have to analyze and say, okay, is it going to be worth maintaining long-term? Because there are other needs for a smaller resource like that and just our smaller ponds that we have throughout the community.
And I'm not saying that you wouldn't rescue anyone in any other body of water, just that's the general.
Very
geography,
much so,
right?
yeah,
Okay.
north and south.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Edson.
Thank you, Councilmember Shields. And to follow up with that, because on the north side, you've got Jackson County, and I'm not sure their rescue boats function well. So might be times when you all are called to Blue Springs Lake or Tacoma.
Very much so, and portions of those lakes are in our jurisdiction anyway, so 9 times out of 10, we're dispatched to those lakes as well.
And Longview?
Longview as well,
And what about Tacoma?
Jacomo as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And what else was that? Oh, on your 13 staff members. How well is recruitment going for the fire department?
So we're moving along, and I feel comfortable to say that we're going to be able to fill those positions. We're actually doing final interviews today and tomorrow on that process. We have a list that is maintained from our previous process that we're hoping to draw several off of, as well as these new individual candidates that have participated in this process last week and this week. So I'm hopeful, not 100% that we'll be able to do that, because in addition to the 13, we also have 2 retirements that we're filling for as well. So we're actually looking at hiring a total of 15 for that class that would begin July 12th or 10th.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
All right, thank you. Chief, just to segue on the 13 FTEs, do you have a good feel on how many paramedics we're going to get out of those 13?
I can say as of today, we have the potential of those 13 to be 5 paramedics and 2 paramedic students in that process. That is the potential. That's saying that everybody is successful in their interviews today and do not accept positions elsewhere during this time.
So that's better than 50% then of the.
That is the current. I'm not going to hold my breath on those final numbers.
And then the boat, the rescue boat, you talked about a pump. Mm-hmm. Now, I assume that would allow for firefighting capacity on the lake. Is that correct? Is that why the pump would be on there?
That's correct.
And not to get too technical, but how big of a line, how big of a hose are we talking?
So it's going to be I believe it's a 500 gallon per minute pump. So size is irrelevant at that point. It's how many gallons can you produce. So it's going to be about 500 GPM.
Okay, so that's pretty good size.
Smaller end, so typical fire trucks, 1,500 to 2,000. So, I mean, you can kind of put that into perspective. But we only plan on using it to operate one hose line, if you will, off of that or master stream.
So if Phyllis's boat's on fire, you can put it out.
We will do our best attempt.
And then the tones, that sort of raised my curiosity. So the tones are actually going to go away, and it's going to be a different alerting system?
So to say, yes, our current process will go away. It actually will be maintained as a backup as we move forward. This would move, now there's still tones involved, but it's how it ramps that up and goes from a more silent, it uses lighting, and it uses other methods of alerting our staff versus just loud tones that bring you out of every condition you're in.
Okay, all right, thank you. This is great stuff, both police and fire. This is great stuff, and it just shows you how great it is to have the public safety sales tax to be able to put it to very, very good use. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, last few slides here. So interestingly enough, as we look at what Chief Forbes and Chief Snyder have just covered with you, similar to the general fund, about 67% in personnel services. I just noticed that. It just happens to mirror, which if I think about police and fire and emergency services, you think about the equipment that they need. Those costs to bring personnel on are typically higher than just some of our general fund folks. So you can see the 10.7 million here being requested. I use the term reasonable approach, and I appreciate both their efforts in putting this together, our very first one, and what is reasonable to bring on in the manner in which was just provided to you. So 10.7 there, and here's our last, next to last slide on fiscal year 24 general fund budget. Balanced budget, again, using 300 plus thousand towards one-time needs there in order to get that to a zero difference. And then going ahead and budgeting and planning for building up a reserve with the first budget we've put together for the PSST. Couple notes there, budget uncertainties. As mentioned, we're still not 100% certain on our insurance at this point in time, but we've put in assumptions there, and we feel are safe assumptions. And then we also know the state legislature is continuously looking at property taxes, whether that be real property, personal property, and in ways that that could disrupt our revenue stream. The same thing on the sales tax front and the franchise tax front, quite frankly. So being mindful of that as we prepare these budgets on what's going on down at Jeff City is certainly on our minds. So I wanted to mention those 2 bullet points. And then wrapping up, hopefully we've put together a budget that reflects our core values and is moving the needle on our strategic plan initiatives. We've aligned some of these with some of the mayor and council priorities through our discussions there. Conservative revenue projections to account for some of those uncertainties, creating that fund balance on the PSST. And then I'll close again with that general fund reserve balance. And like I said, I know we talked about that last year and would like to keep that at the forefront. I know around this time of years where committees get reappointed, and I don't know if that kind of got us disconnected a little bit. I know the Finance Committee did start in on some of that general fund reserve policy discussion, but I want to keep that at the forefront, given where our general fund reserve is on the general fund side as we move forward. So that concludes our presentation, and we'll stand for any questions.
Any questions from the committee?
I have a comment.
Okay. Councilmember Edson.
Going back to the reserve fund, you know, I think somehow we are doing so well this year with the marijuana tax and the public safety sales tax. And we have money this year that I haven't seen us have since I've been on here. But going back to the reserve fund, I mean, we have all these buckets of money. So sometimes it's really hard when we go, hey, we're going to buy this and that and the other. And you get citizens calling, going, my curbs are falling apart. And I go, well, okay, 5 years from now, your curbs will be fixed. Well, doesn't the city have the money? Yes, but we don't have it in the right pot. So that, to take any more money and put it in reserve when we know there are things that need to be fixed, just is really hard.
Yeah. And we as staff have already talked about, gosh, what would be some of those priorities, anticipating discussions with the Finance and Budget Committee and the mayor and the council. We would bring that information, very similar to what we did on the no tax increase, right? What kinds of opportunities does this present that we could bring to bear? So it'd be a good discussion that we could have on how best to utilize those resources to better the community.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. You have a question? Okay. I do have a question that I'm going to go back quite a ways to the expansion needs for reoccurring expenses. And I notice we have the cultural arts a person in the audience, and I have a question for her. And that is, if you want to come up, or you can sit there, I guess, it doesn't matter. That way we won't be yelling at each other. but as you come down, at one time, I was reviewing the cultural arts, you know, the whole structure of that. And there was a statement in there about a 501(c)(3). And I just wondered, are we still on track for the 501(c)(3)? And if you could just give us a.
Yeah. Sure. Good afternoon, Glenda Masters, Cultural Arts Manager. Yes, the process of creating the 501(c)(3) arts support organization is still moving forward and still in progress. Some members of the former Arts Council that is now kind of, not say gone defunct, but then now become the Cultural Commission, former members of the Arts Council have gathered community members to form a new organization called Lee Summit Creates. They are still very much in the early formation phase, and we are also working with them. So developing that partnership with the city to kind of find out what does that partner organization look like, and what types of resources might they need, how can the city support that. So it is moving forward. We're still in the very early stages of that, but that's kind of just a general high-level update.
So this expansion position would just aid you in creating everything going forward? I mean, helping with the.
I think that's a good way to put that in kind of some of the simplest terms. I cannot be in two places at one time. And so just having an additional staff person will help supplement a lot of what I'm currently doing, but then also giving us the opportunity to kind of divide and conquer and to grow what we are currently doing, but also provide more support services to arts organizations and arts groups in the community.
All right. Oh, thank you, Glenda. I think Councilmember Edson now has a question.
Yeah, but Lee Summit Creates isn't the city.
Correct. At this point, yeah,
501(c)(3).
correct.
Okay.
Yeah, but we're
So-
still trying to figure out what that partnership relationship looks like and what that could be. That's kind of as far as we've gotten at the moment, just trying to figure out who could do what the best way possible and where each organization focuses.
Okay. So that all the arts organizations aren't trying to get the same pot of money?
Correct.
Right.
We're trying to minimize that as much as possible.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, now I have another question. So, having said that, are you able to bring those groups together and maybe collaborate a little bit more? Because I know they're sort of standalone and they want to remain standalone and bring those folks together.
That's what we're trying to work through at this very early kind of stage of that formation. And so helping them kind of create their autonomy, but again, what does that relationship look like with the city? How can they help us as a city accomplish some of our cultural goals, but then also how can we help them grow and become self-sustaining as well?
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.
And then I will echo Councilmember Edson's comments. Yeah, and I liked your explanation about the budget reserve or the reserve fund. We were going to do it, and then it sort of fell by the wayside. And yeah, I would welcome more discussion on that, and maybe get down to what we're going to do with that. And then piggyback on that is and I know I talked to Donna and Betty about this, about doing the same thing for public safety sales tax. However, we're going to have to wait a while and see how that shakes out. I mean, however long it takes, but yeah, and that way we'll always have a little bit of money.
Yep.
And did you have something, or? I do, I wasn't sure. Okay, we'll just wait then. Okay, thank you.
I did have one other thought as my mind was going in the cultural arts environment, knowing that we have this opportunity across the street here with that amenity that we're pursuing over there. Just that provides a physical space for that programming and some of those needs that don't exist today, but makes sense from a resource perspective to start building that bench strength, if you will, for what we envision across the street.
And I don't know if you caught wind of that, and this could have been in roundtable too, but the KC Current Stadium, they're going to have a farmer's market and an event space. I wonder where they got that idea.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we'll just move right into roundtable then, and Councilmember Shields.
So yeah, I enjoyed the presentation today. I think this is great. One thing that was on my mind that I wanted to ask about is the destination marketing organization that we've talked about in the past. I don't know if that's a topic that this committee would address, or so. I know that we had talked before about, as a body, you know, setting aside money for that, and then I was just kind of wondering where we were in that process, because we saw in this presentation that bringing out a marketing specialist, which I know is kind of separate, but seems like dovetails, so.
Crystal Weber, Assistant City Manager. So the DMO Working Group, which had representatives from our community partners, will start meeting in the next couple of weeks to work on a bylaws group to bring forward to the council, and then from that, the DMO board will get established and work with the consultant that you met before that did the DMO needs study to bring forward their strategic plan and their business plan, which then will have a, I'm guessing, a financial component request to the city.
So is that something that we might see in a future year's budget, but it's still kind of in the early stages?
I
or-
am
or an
really
amendment to
hoping
this
you will
year?
see that coming back hopefully in our mid-year request.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll let you.
And I'll add to that, you were kind of talking about the Business and Industry Fund as a resource, right, a revenue stream. And so we have the DMO that's still coming forward. We have the consideration with the Economic Development Organization that we've talked about. And then thinking about, you know, the Lee Summit Creates Group. So when we look at that Business and Industry Fund, that's something that would certainly be coming back here to the Finance Committee as we shape those environments to see, you know, how's that, those revenues put to work for those respective environments. So it's not something that we've covered here. And I actually, Betty, do we cover B&I funding in the other funds? Okay, so that'd be at June 5th, but you'll kind of see some of that data then.
Okay, that's part of what I wasn't sure if that was
Yeah.
part of general fund or if it'd be in a future.
No, it's a dedicated fund, so
Okay,
it doesn't flow into the general fund.
thank you so much.
Do you have anything for us? Any staff roundtable? Anybody want to? There's so many people
We
here.
don't get this many people at council.
I know.
Y'all just sit there and do this.
Here we go.
Just sit here and hold your hands up.
Yeah.
I failed to do this, but you saw some resources come up here, Eric and Rick and Betty and Donna Lake. I am thankful for that's our budget team and myself. We've put together a budget team so that not only to prepare this budget, but then as the budget's monitored throughout the year to be more mindful of it so that at the end of the year, right, in my mind, putting 14 million into a general fund reserve isn't really maximizing those resources. So being more mindful of that, paying more attention to that throughout the year. So I want to thank all of them for their efforts in putting this together, as well as the management team and all the budget technicians that have gone into this work. It's a lot of work that goes into this, so I appreciate all those efforts.
It is a lot of work, and I do also want to thank everybody that had a part in this, and of course, everybody that showed up tonight. I mean, even though not everybody got to talk, this is really important. And so, got anything else? No. Anybody else? Next meeting will be June 5th in the council chambers here at 4 p.m. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you.